He was an experienced explorer who thought he'd seen it all. But this time, he went too far, deep beneath the earth, in a narrow tunnel no human should ever enter. He ignored every warning, and what happened next became one of the most horrifying cave tragedies in history. This isn't just a story of courage. It's a story of obsession, fear, and a gruesome end no one could have imagined. To the world, Alex was more than a man. He was a living myth. His name was spoken with a reverence usually reserved for astronauts and pioneers of old. He was the man who had charted the uncharted, who had walked in places where sunlight was a forgotten memory. His home was a museum of his own triumphs. Framed articles praised his nerves of steel, and gleaming trophies celebrated his courage. His smile, plastered across a dozen magazine covers, was confident, effortless, and a complete lie. The world saw the hero, the adventurer who laughed in the face of the abyss. But his wife, Lena, saw the truth. She saw the man who would sit for hours, staring into the fireplace, the flames reflecting a hollow emptiness in his eyes. She saw the way his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking, the way he meticulously cleaned his gear not with passion, but with a quiet, desperate ritual. The world celebrated his last great discovery, calling it the pinnacle of a legendary career. They saw a man who had reached the summit and could now rest. Lena saw a man terrified not of the darkness below, but of the silence that awaited him in the light. The accolades were anchors, pulling him down, and the pressure of his own legend was becoming a cage far tighter than any crevice. He needed one more descent, not for glory, but for escape. The map was a siren's song. It detailed the abyssal vein, a cave system so deep, so notoriously treacherous, it was spoken of in whispers among the caving community. It wasn't a place of exploration. It was a place of folklore, a geological nightmare that had humbled every person who dared approach it. At the heart of the map was a passage marked with a single, chilling word: Devourer. This was the challenge Alex had chosen. Before he left, he visited his mentor Elias, a man whose own legendary career had been cut short by a close call that stole the nerve from his bones, but left him with a profound wisdom. Elias didn't speak of technical dangers. He didn't mention the risk of rockfalls or flooding. He simply looked at his protege, his eyes filled with a sad, knowing pity. "That cave doesn't test your skill, Alex," he'd whispered, his voice raspy with age. "It tests your soul. It preys on the part of you that wants to disappear. It finds the reason you're really there, and it uses it to keep you separate." Alex had offered a hollow smile, assuring his old friend that this was just one last trip, a final chapter to close the book. But Elias saw through the performance. He saw the frantic hunger in Alex's eyes. It wasn't the thrill of discovery that was driving him. It was something else, something darker. It was a pilgrimage, and the destination was oblivion. The day of his departure was a media circus. Cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions about legacy, about courage, about what it felt like to be a modern-day titan. Alex played his part perfectly. He was charming, humble, and radiated an aura of calm control. He spoke of the importance of pushing boundaries of the human spirit's insatiable curiosity. It was a beautiful speech, full of all the words the world wanted to hear. Standing beside him, Lena felt like a ghost at a parade. She smiled when he smiled, her hand locked in his, but the connection felt cold, distant. She could feel the chasm that had grown between them, wider and darker than any cave he had ever explored. The reporters saw a supportive wife. She felt like an unwilling accomplice to a slow, methodical suicide. Her final words to him weren't a plea to be careful, as they had been so many times before. She'd already begged him not to go, her tears met with a gentle but unshakable resolve. This time, as he turned to leave, she simply whispered, "Don't forget the way back home, Alex." He paused, his back to her, the hero's mask momentarily slipping. For a single, fleeting second, she saw the terrified man underneath. Then he straightened his pack, gave one last wave to the cameras, and walked toward the trailhead without looking back, disappearing into the wilderness that guarded the entrance to the Earth's most unforgiving secret. The roar of the media faded behind him, replaced by the whispering wind at the mouth of the abyssal vein. Here, the performance was over. There were no cameras, no admirers, just Alex and the gaping maw of the earth. The entrance wasn't grand. It was a scar on the landscape, a jagged crack that seemed to inhale the light around it. As he stepped across the threshold, the temperature dropped instantly. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling of damp stone and an ancient, undisturbed silence. The world above, with its expectations and its noise, ceased to exist. Down here, he was no longer a legend. He was just a man, a small, fragile creature trespassing in a realm of immense geological power. His headlamp cut a sharp, lonely beam through the darkness, revealing walls that seemed to weep with moisture. The first few hours were a familiar rhythm of descent, the scrape of his boots on rock, the metallic clink of his gear, the sound of his own steady breathing. He moved with a practiced grace, his body remembering the thousands of hours spent in similar places. But this place felt different. It wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was indifferent. It did not care that he was here, and it did not care if he ever left. He was a foreign thought in an ancient mind, and with every step deeper, he could feel his own significance, his own identity, starting to dissolve into the profound, patient dark. Hours bled into a timeless twilight, marked only by the slow depletion of his energy. He eventually arrived at the place Elias had warned him about, the passage known as the Devourer. It wasn't a tunnel or a crawl space. It was a crack, a vertical fissure in the rock so tight it seemed to defy physics. It was a place designed by nature to be impassable. Looking at it, Alex felt the first real flicker of fear. This was not a calculated risk. It was a gamble against geology itself. For a moment, he stopped. The voice of his mentor echoed in the silence of his mind. It preys on the part of you that wants to disappear, He thought of Lena, of her last, pleading look. He thought of the warm sun on his face, a sensation that suddenly felt like a distant, impossible dream. The world above called to him, a faint whisper of reason and love he could turn back. No one would ever know. He could return a hero who had wisely met his match. But then another voice, a deeper and more powerful one, rose from within. It was the voice of the hollow man by the fireplace, the voice that craved the crushing finality of the deep earth. It promised him not glory, but release. It told him that turning back meant returning to the gilded cage of his own legacy. It told him that true peace lay on the other side of that crack. He took a deep, shuddering breath, exhaled all his doubt, and pushed himself into the fissure. The rock was colder than ice. It pressed in on him from all sides, a relentless, unforgiving pressure on his chest, his back, his hips. He had to exhale completely just to gain a millimeter of forward, or rather downward, progress. The process was agonizingly slow. Scrape, breathe out, wriggle, push. The sound of his own heart hammered in his ears, a frantic drumbeat in the tomb-like silence. He was no longer climbing. He was being swallowed. Then it happened. A slight shift in his position, a miscalculation of an angle, and the movement stopped. He tried to push forward, but the rock held him fast. He tried to wriggle back, but a wedge of stone he had just passed now dug into his back, locking him in place. There was no panic at first, just a cold, analytical assessment of the situation. He was an expert, and experts solved problems. He tried to control his breathing, to relax his muscles, to make himself smaller, but the rock was absolute. It did not yield. It did not negotiate. The minutes stretched into an hour. The analytical mind gave way to a primal, rising terror. The beam of his headlamp illuminated nothing but the rough texture of the stone inches from his eyes. He was trapped. He was utterly and completely alone, pinned inside the skeleton of the world, with nothing but the sound of his own ragged breaths and the immense, crushing weight of a silence that would last for eternity. When Alex failed to emerge at the scheduled time, the silence at the trailhead was more terrifying than any alarm. The initial response was quiet, professional. A small team sent to the entrance, their calls echoing unanswered into the dark. But the news cycle is not patient, and the story of a missing hero is irresistible. Within a day, the circus was back. News vans lined the quiet road to their home, their satellite dishes like vultures waiting for a tragedy to unfold. Lena became a prisoner in her own house, the flashes of cameras piercing her windows at all hours. Every news report was a fresh torment. Experts appeared on television, pointing at diagrams of the Abyssinian vein, using words like unrecoverable and body retrieval. They debated his motives. Was it arrogance, a death wish, a tragic mistake? His life, their life together, was dissected and repackaged for public consumption. His most intimate moments became fodder for speculation. She saw his magazine covers everywhere, his smiling face a cruel mockery of the horror she knew he was enduring. Her private grief was stolen from her, turned into a public spectacle. The world wanted a story with a clear hero and a clear moral. All Lena wanted was her husband back, but the man she was grieving was not the one they were talking about on the news. They were mourning a legend. She was mourning the quiet, broken man who had gone into the dark to find an ending. The pressure for a rescue operation was immense. The public, fed a steady diet of Alex's heroic past, demanded a miracle. How could the world stand by and let its greatest explorer perish? But the people who truly understood the earth, the ones who had been to the edge of that darkness themselves, knew the truth. They convened a panel of the world's most elite cave rescue specialists. His old mentor, Elias, was called in to consult. The meeting was short and somber. They looked at the surveys, the geological data, and the first-hand accounts of the abyssal vein. They knew the Devourer passage. To send another person into that fissure would not be a rescue. It would be the creation of a second victim. Elias, his face etched with a grief that felt centuries old, had to deliver the final verdict to the media. He stood before the cameras, his voice heavy with the weight of his words, and explained that Alex was beyond reach. He didn't use technical jargon. He simply said, "The mountain has made its decision. We cannot ask another soul to face what he faced. The rescue is over." It was a statement of crushing finality. There would be no dramatic recovery. There would be no closure. The hero would not be coming home. The abyssal vein would become his tomb, and his final desperate moments would remain his own, a secret kept forever by the silent, unmoving stone. In the years that followed, the story of Alex calcified into a modern myth. He became a cautionary tale, a symbol of hubris, a hero who flew too close to the sun nor, in his case, burrowed too deep into the earth. The abyssal vein was permanently sealed. A simple bronze plaque was placed at the entrance, turning the site of a horrifying tragedy into a sterile, government-approved memorial. It listed his name, his dates, and his major accomplishments. It was a neat and tidy summary that erased all the messy human details. Lena rarely visited the plaque honored the legend, not the man she had loved. She had learned to live with the echoes, the ghost of his presence in their quiet home. She had made a fragile peace with the media's narrative, allowing them to own the story of the arrogant explorer so she could keep the memory of the troubled husband for herself. The world remembered his gruesome end, the horror of being trapped, a story told and retold to frighten and fascinate. But for Lena, the true horror wasn't his end. It was the slow, agonizing journey that had led him there, the gradual extinguishing of his light, the quiet desperation she had been powerless to stop. He hadn't just died in that cave, he had been disappearing for years, and the rock was simply the last thing to hold him. A decade after the entrance was sealed, a new generation of explorers, inspired and sobered by Alex's story, were granted limited access to the upper, safer chambers of the abyssal vein. One young caver, exploring near the sealed passage, found something tucked away in a small, dry alcove, almost as if it had been intentionally left behind. It was a small, waterproof field journal. It was Alex's. The final entries were written just hours before he entered the Devourer. They were not the words of a glory-seeking adventurer. They were a confession. He wrote about a previous expedition years earlier, one that the public never knew the full story of. A young, promising caver under his guidance had been critically injured due to a decision Alex had made. The boy survived, but would never walk again. Alex had buried the guilt, letting the world celebrate him while he was privately consumed by the failure. The journal ended with a final, chilling sentence. "Elias was right," he wrote. "This cave preys on the part of you that wants to disappear. I'm not here to conquer a cave. I'm here to serve a sentence. Some tombs you don't find, some tombs you choose." The world believed he had ignored every warning in a quest for fame, but the truth was infinitely more tragic. He had heard every warning perfectly, and he had followed them step by agonizing step to the one place on earth he believed he truly deserved to be. His gruesome end wasn't an accident. It was an atonement.